From time to time, we'll invite the members of the Christian Apologetics Alliance. They have a group on Facebook. They also do things outside of Facebook to ask some questions, Dr. Craig, and boy, do they send some doozies. We've got a collection that they have agreed to ask, and I asked them what they would like to ask you, but also asked them if they would like to include what they think are some of the pressing issues in Christian philosophy and apologetics, and some of them have given us some things, and so we'll look at those as well.
I'm really grateful for these questions, Kevin, and you can just tell by the tone of these. They're so different than the questions that I get from secular people or university audiences, which are often challenging and hostile, and I appreciate so much the open and transparent tone of many of these questions.
W. Russell Crawford says, has Dr. Craig ever specifically addressed the health and wealth or prosperity gospel? I would love to hear him offer a thought, preferably certain philosophical and theological problems, on the system. And he adds, simply because this system is exploding.
I have addressed this issue here and there. I think that the health and wealth gospel is a fundamental betrayal of the biblical gospel. I would suggest that Russ take a listen to the talk I have given called Failure. As a result of a catastrophic failure in my own life, I came to a new insight on the will of God for one's life, and that was that God's will for your life can be that you fail. God can lead you into failure, because I think He has things to teach you through failure that you would never learn through success. Moreover, my work on the problem of evil has suggested to me that God may allow suffering and evil to enter your life, because in the providential plan that God has for human history, it may help to form the context or send a ripple effect through history that will bring about God's good purposes. So that it's just completely incorrect to think that God wants every Christian to be prosperous and happy in this life. So I would say that this is a gospel that is not the genuine gospel of Jesus Christ. This is a gospel that won't preach in Iraq. It won't preach in Syria. It won't preach in North Korea. And if it won't preach there, then it's not the real gospel.
Okay. Danny asked, Dr. Craig, after having finished listening to your 20-part podcast on the creation evolution subject, I've been curious about your particular view on this issue. The best I can gather, based upon the arguments that you critique and the arguments that you seem to support, is that it seems as though you believe that all living things as they are today may have been created from what I will tentatively call an intelligent molding process of former living things into current living things, rather than ex nihilo creation of creatures over time, which you referred to somewhat negatively as almost magical, with the possibility of some minimal common descent via the Darwinian mechanism for creatures that are very similar. Would you please explain, describe, or clarify your view?
Well, it would be hard for me to describe it or clarify better than what Danny has done. I thought that was a very fair and accurate description. I am very open to where the evidence leads, because I think theologically, biblically faithful Christians have a wide range of options available to them about the development of biological complexity. And I do tend toward a progressive creationism that would not be the sudden and, as I say, almost magical appearance of, say, rhinoceri suddenly on the African savanna, or of whales suddenly popping into being ex nihilo in the oceans, but that God, through this molding process, would bring about the development and progressive creation of biological complexity. I don't know that that's right, but that seems to be a view that would meet the evidence that we have today, and I think would be biblically consistent. So it's a view that I tend toward.
Joel says, in the past, Dr. Craig has made a proposal to the effect that God, in his middle knowledge, knows those who would accept him and those who would reject him, and places those who would accept him at a time and place in history to hear and receive. My question is, what does Dr. Craig do with Matthew 11:20 through 24, where Christ essentially states that if he had ministered to various Gentile nations in history, which God had destroyed for their rebellion, they would have repented? It seems that God, in his middle knowledge, knew that with a certain amount of revelation, they would have repented and avoided judgment, but he chose to withhold the necessary amount of revelation. How does this square with Molinism?
Well, Matthew 11:20-24 was one of the favorite proof texts of early Molinists. This was one of the scriptural citations that they would give to show that God has middle knowledge. Jesus says that if the miracles done in Bethsaida and Chorazin had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago. And so this proves God has middle knowledge. So the verse, if interpreted in that way, is actually a proof text for middle knowledge, but it would be inconsistent with my views that I've suggested concerning the exclusivity of salvation through Christ. However, I think, as Anthony Kenny has argued, that this verse is probably not meant to be a serious statement of middle knowledge on Jesus' part. I think this is probably more plausibly interpreted in his historical context as religious hyperbole. It's Jesus' way of saying how bad these people in Bethsaida and Chorazin really are. This is how really rotten and hard-hearted you people are. But it's probably not meant to be literally a divine disclosure of middle knowledge of certain counterfactuals. And so I don't use it as a proof text for middle knowledge. And then for the same reason, I am not troubled by the fact that the hypothesis that I've suggested with regard to Christian particularism would be inconsistent with taking this verse as a literal piece of middle knowledge.
Yeah, it's almost like saying, man, if I had all the money I spent on you, I would be a billionaire.
Yeah, exactly, Kevin. Yes.
Yeah. And so now
and in the historical context, that's surely right.
Yeah.
It's not supposed to be middle knowledge that the historical Jesus has suddenly become aware of.
Yeah. By the way, that's true as far as my kids. If I had that money, I would be. Anyway. Thomas Moore says, how does Dr. Craig feel about using eschatology as proof of the Bible's authenticity?
I'm not persuaded that this is effective. I take it he's talking here about fulfilled prophecies of
eschatology
the end times.
Being the end times.
Yeah, the end times. And I just don't find that very convincing, I guess.
Well, especially if it hadn't ended yet, it's kind of hard to use it as
yeah, how do you know that we are in the eschaton? So I think eschatology is more interesting in comparing with what physical eschatology has to say about the end of the universe and contrasting theological eschatology and physical eschatology. That's very interesting. But I'm not a devotee of end-time prophecies.
Danny asked, I have a question about the Kalam cosmological argument. How can a timeless being initiate the beginning of universe and enter time, since such a change in state would itself require time? I don't even know if I phrased this question correctly, but I'm sure Dr. Craig will know what I'm getting at. This issue has been one of the main reasons I shy away from using the argument.
Yes, let me address the last comment. He shouldn't shy away from using the argument because of this, because the argument doesn't require that God be timeless without the universe. He could adopt a view like Alan Paget's, for example, that God exists in a sort of non-metric time prior to the creation of the universe, in which there are no intervals of 1,000 years, a minute, a second, or whatever. So you could hold, if you want to, that God exists in a kind of non-metric time prior to the origin of the universe, and the Kalam argument will still go through because it's dealing with metric time where you can distinguish temporal intervals from each other. But the reason I adopt the timelessness view is because I think it's a more plausible view. If you think of God existing changelessly alone, on a relational view of time, he would be timeless because there is no change, and so there are no events. There would be no before and after. And if he then creates the universe, yes, that requires time, right, so that's why time begins to exist. So time comes into existence concomitantly or coincidentally with the act of creation. But I don't see that it would require time before the act of creation. To say that is true, Kevin, would be to say that when God creates the universe, not only does time come into being at that point, but there is a kind of retroactive effect that makes time come into being prior to that point. But that doesn't seem to make sense because God existing alone, changelessly without the universe, is timeless. And then are we to think that he creates a universe and there's this kind of retroactive effect such that now there is time prior to the beginning of the universe? Or are we to think that there is always time prior to the beginning of the universe because God creates the universe at a certain moment of time? That would posit backward causation. There would be backward causation of time from an event that's in the future, namely the creation, and I think that's metaphysically impossible. So it seems to me that the best view is to simply say that there is no time at all when God is changeless and alone, and that time begins with the act of creation and goes from there.
Okay. David says, Kevin, I'm sure Dr. Craig has addressed this before, but as I journey more deeply into apologetics, I find a lot of resistance coming from other Christians. Many believers seem to think that science and religion are mutually exclusive, so a thoughtful discussion of the Kalam, for example, is considered out of bounds. Do you have any suggestions for how we can lovingly foster these conversations within the body of believers?
I want to suggest to David a different strategy. Bill Bright, who was the founder and president of Campus Crusade for Christ, urged his staff, as he put it, to move with the movers. That is to say, to find those students who are ready and eager to be discipled and to learn how to do evangelism and to bring others to Christ, and not to spend time inordinately with students who were apathetic or not ready to engage in, not really interested in discipleship. And he said, I recognize that these people are important too. Christ loves them, they're important, and they need to be ministered to by the church. But he said, Campus Crusade for Christ is not a hospital. It's a movement of discipleship and evangelism. And so he encouraged the staff to move with the movers, as he would put it. And I would similarly encourage David not to be overly concerned in trying to pull teeth from people who aren't interested and don't care, but rather to try to identify that minority of people who are interested and who want to get involved and to begin to disciple and work with them. And I think that will be far more fruitful than trying to convince people who are uninterested that they really ought to be involved in doing this.
I like how he puts, how can we lovingly foster these conversations? Because generally, I will say, are you crazy? Some of my friends get very impatient. And you can be very impatient if you're saying, oh, this is a very important issue, and you're, yeah. Let me tell you a quick story. I may have told before. Pat Zuckerin, a friend of ours, speaks on apologetics all over the country, and youth minister over lunch, church luncheon there at the church before he spoke, in California, gave Pat the opinion that, Pat, you don't even need to be doing this apologetic stuff. Kids don't want that.
Who said that to
This
him?
was a youth minister
Oh,
at this particular
I thought
church.
I
He
said that.
No. Pat, you don't need to be doing apologetics and things like that. Students aren't interested in that kind of a thing. I don't think I don't think that's the way to reach them. I think you reach them, just with the gospel and the whole thing. Pat said, no, you're wrong, and gave him his reasons. Well, the guy went up to go teach a Bible study of the youth. Came back a few minutes later and said, Pat, would you come in here? The kids have a question about the reliability of the New Testament, and I don't know what to say. So Pat went in and did a little mini seminar on the reliability of the New Testament for them, and he said the light went on in that youth director's head at that moment. So thought I would throw that in.
Yeah.
Move with the movers. I like that. Kevin, I wanted to ask Dr. Craig if he is aware of the semantic argument and what he thinks of the argument. Are you aware of that?
The short answer is no, I am not.
All right. We'll look into it, maybe do a podcast on it.
Probably not.
Where did, John asks, where did Jesus go during the time he was dead? If it was not hell, then why is it that people will go to hell as punishment, but Jesus didn't have to in order to take our punishment? The Bible seems to indicate Jesus' death was punishment enough for our salvation. So why is a person's death not punishment enough for their personal wrongs? I know this sounds like I'm making an argument for annihilation, but I assure you I'm not an annihilationist. I've just always wondered about this one.
Well, the Scripture actually answers the question of where Jesus went between his death and resurrection. 1 Peter 3:19 says that he went and preached to the spirits that are in prison. These would be the souls of the dead in the nether world of the departed. And he didn't go there in order to be punished himself. Rather, he went there to proclaim the victory over sin and death and Satan. So the question then is really one about the endurance of the punishment. I think he's right in saying that the Bible seems to indicate Jesus' death was punishment enough for our salvation. That's the punishment for sin. The wages of sin is death, and Jesus experienced death on our behalf. So why is it not enough for us simply to die and that be punishment enough? Well, the real issue here, I guess, is not why that would be punishment enough for us. I think it's very obvious that merely dying physically isn't sufficient punishment. Indeed, many people would feel that they've gotten off the hook easy if that's all the punishment they get for sin. The more significant punishment would be a kind of spiritual death that persists in eternity in hell. And the question would be, why didn't Jesus' death then have to be persistent in that way rather than momentary and reversed by the resurrection? And it must have something to do with the dignity of his person, Kevin. It must have something to do with the fact that he's not merely human, but he's divine. And that in virtue of who he is, the second person of the Trinity, that God could reverse that sentence of death upon Jesus and raise him from the dead so that that state doesn't persist.
Eugene asked, is it more effective to get someone to disagree with gay marriage on the basis of its social implications, or would it be better to try to convert them to Christianity beforehand so they can clearly see why homosexual behavior is wrong?
I think this is a good question, and I would say emphatically the latter course. I think it's probably futile to try to argue with most unbelievers that same-sex marriage is wrong or that homosexual behavior is wrong. What we need to do is to be engaged in sharing the gospel, winning people to Christ, and then discipling them in biblical ethics. And that will be the best hope of producing change of view in their ethical behavior. But you can't expect people to clean up their ethical act prior to becoming a Christian. So I think that focusing on social implications of same-sex marriage and these sorts of issues is actually apt to increase people's resistance to the gospel more than it will help. Greg Gansel, who worked for many years at Yale University and with the Rivendell Institute, has said that Christian opposition to homosexuality is probably the greatest barrier to the gospel for unbelievers in his experience at Yale. Now that's really, really problematic, Kevin, because I don't think this is an issue on which we can compromise. This is an area of biblical ethics that is pretty unequivocal. It's pretty clear we can't compromise. But I think that what Greg says is probably true, and that therefore it would be imprudent or unwise evangelistically to try to focus on this kind of issue rather than focus on arguments for God's existence, evidence for the resurrection, and trying to get people to become Christians so that then in the course of their discipleship, their ethical views can begin to change. I can only add to that, the reason you and I have done podcasts on things like same-sex marriage and so forth is not for the benefit of the unbeliever, but for the sake of the church. I think the church does need to have clear teaching on this issue. We mustn't compromise biblical ethics or biblical stance on marriage, and therefore the church, and especially the younger generation of Christians, which are under tremendous pressure to compromise in this area, need to have good teaching. And so for that reason, I think one addresses the issue. But it's not going to be effective, I think, in dealing with culture at large.
The issue is Jesus, not homosexuality, when it comes to a person who doesn't know Christ.
Well said.
And it's not like, all right, quit smoking, drinking, and cussing and come to the Lord. It's come to the Lord and He will make you into what He wants you to be. I mean, that's our message, Bill. That's the good news.
Yeah.
Thank you for that question, Eugene. I appreciate it. Tyson, a couple of more here, Bill. Tyson says, Kevin, I'm the chapter director for Reasonable Faith, Monterey Bay. I found Reasonable Faith's resources to be invaluable for equipping Christians intellectually, and I would love to see more chapters started around the world. Could you have Dr. Craig give a quick rundown on the simple process for starting a chapter for those who may be interested?
I would be glad to, Tyson. And he's right, it is simple. I am surprised at how some people think this is so difficult when in fact it's easy. All you got to do is share with us your personal testimony to show that you are a genuine, born-again Christian who's walking with the Lord. You then need to sign a doctrinal statement that is a general statement of evangelical biblical orthodoxy about Christian worldviews so that we know you're not a heretic. And then the last thing is you need to complete the Reasonable Faith workbook, which is a fill-in-the-blank workbook on the book I wrote, Reasonable Faith. And by filling out the notebook or the workbook, it will show that you understand the contents of Reasonable Faith and are prepared to teach it. And so you will send your testimony, your doctrinal statement, and the completed workbook to Stephen McAndrew, who is the National Director for Chapters, and he will grade the workbook to make sure you've answered each question correctly. If there are questions that you have not answered correctly, he'll return it to you and say, this answer wasn't accurate. Look again and redo this one. And after one has completed that process, then we are going to give you a platform where you can use our name and our logo and materials to launch your own ministry. This is a way to empower you to have a ministry of your own. So I would encourage folks to take advantage of it.
This question, Dr. Craig, what do you take to be the greatest challenge to the Kalam cosmological argument?
I suppose I would say that skepticism that the actual infinite is just a strange and seemingly paradoxical idea, but there's nothing really absurd about it. You just swallow hard and say that's the way it is, if there can be an actually infinite number of things. And then with respect to the scientific evidence for the universe, you would just sort of say, play the skeptic's card and say, well, we don't know enough yet. It's still very uncertain that the universe began to exist. It may be that the future advance of science will restore the eternality of the universe. And beyond that, I think that's about the best you can do. There's not much more you can do to challenge the argument, I think, than that.
TW asked, well, this is not an apologetics related question, but why does Dr. Craig have no audio books? Every atheist has an audiobook version available, but not Dr. Craig. Just wondering, considering younger people seem to like podcast.
You know, I'll be honest, the truth is I don't know how to get an audiobook version. I think I've asked my publishers, like David C. Cook, would you like to make an audiobook of On Guard? And I don't think I've got any nibbles. So if he knows how this is done, tell me. I'm just ignorant. I don't know how to get an audio book produced, but I'd love to have some.
Okay. Brandon says, Kevin, I think good apologetics in the area of biblical scholarship is absolutely critical at this point. I find very often that philosophical apologetics come in second place to questions of what really happened in history. In my experience, it is rather easy to take someone from atheism to agnosticism, pseudo-deism, and very difficult to get them to make that jump to Christian orthodoxy. The false controversies created by the History Channel, like Did Jesus Exist? And the subtle, semi-scholarly hit pieces that people like Bart Ehrman produce are extremely popular. Nobody has ever heard of Darrell Bach or Daniel Wallace or Craig Evans.
Yeah, I had to laugh when I read this because at least until a few years ago, no one had ever heard of me either. And so I'm very encouraged that he would think that philosophical apologetics are so effective today. That has not been my experience. I don't find, in my experience, people objecting so much to the historical issues as to the philosophical questions. And it seems to me that if you can get a person from one side of the Grand Canyon of atheism to the other side of theism, that then it's just a little gulch to get them from theism to Christianity. And given the fine work of people like Evans and Wallace and Bach and so many others, we just have abundant resources on the historical Jesus today. And it's a shame that nobody's heard of them in Brandon's experience, because I think in the same way that there has been this renaissance of Christian philosophy going on over the last half century, there has been similarly a renaissance in historical Jesus studies going on as well, so that some of the best historical Jesus scholars today would be people that are recognizably evangelical. So the resources are there, and we just need to make people more familiar with them.
Right. I like how he says these false controversies that are always being presented by the History Channel, with provocative, attention-getting titles. Did Jesus exist? The lost years of Jesus and things like that. It's like these little fires that are totally unnecessary, but nevertheless we have to keep putting them out. And so I know that can be it. Let's conclude for today, and we will look at some more questions from the Christian Apologetics Alliance next time on Reasonable Faith with Dr. William Lane Craig.